Good evening or good morning, depending on where you are. Welcome to this webinar on the customization options that we have in OCPP 1.6 and 2.0.1. My name is Firmware, and I've been involved with the development of OCPP since its very inception, I could say. And I enjoy the possibility to explain a bit about customization options in this webinar. So the OCPP protocol defines a set of standard messages for a generic organization and a central system. But specific implementation may, of course, require features that are not supported by OCPP. So as of version 1.5, OCPP has provided support for custom configuration and messages. And we have hugely extended these possibilities in OCPP 2.0.1. We will first explain what's now possible in 1.6. And by the way, as an Open Charge Alliance member, you can actively participate in the development of the protocol. So if you feel that certain features are lacking, please join us and help us to make that part of the language in the future. So we start with 1.6. What can we do in 1.6? Well, we have basically three options. You can define your own configuration parameters using the change configuration command. And you can do quite a lot with that. You can define your own message using the data transfer. And if you really want to, you can transfer a complete file to a charge point using the firmware update mechanism. I will address all three of them in the next slides. So change configuration. Change configuration is just a set of messages where you can set the value to a certain parameter. And there's always a key value pair. And with change configuration, you can set it. And with get configuration, you can get either all configuration keys or a specific one. And the specification has a whole list of standardized keys that you can use to control the behavior of the charge point. For example, the local authorized offline parameter. If you set that to true, then you tell the charge point that it's okay to authorize an ID tag locally when it's offline. But you can also use it to define your own custom keys. Of course, the other side that you're talking with has to know about this custom key, but then you can do it. So I'll give you an example of such a situation. So we can define our new keys, and we can use that to convey information to the central system. So one example, for example, would be as a charge point, I want to tell the central system what my software version is. So I could define a configuration key called software version. And then if the central system sets command get configuration request software version, then I can reply my software version and whether this is a read-only or writable key. This will, of course, be read-only. Here's an example where the charge point conveys information to the central system, but you can also do it the other way around. So I can use a custom key to send data to the charge point. For example, those who know OCPP 2.1 know that 2.1 has a functionality to support the messages you want to show on your display. But in 1.6 we don't have it. But we can create a custom key called display text. And then if we set the value of display text, we can have the charge point show that on the display. Of course, the charge point needs to have the customized firmware that monitors this variable, and if it changes it, it displays it on the display. But if you have that, then you don't need any really custom message to support this. Well, the other option was the data transfer. And data transfer is basically the workhorse for customization, because you can literally do anything with it. Because data transfer sends any string, and the string, the data field in it, can be plain text, can be a list of comma-separated values, it can be SOAP, it can be JSON. You define it. But of course, the other side has to know what's in it, so it has to know what customization you're using. So this command therefore contains 3 parameters. It has a vendor ID. That's basically the name that you as a vendor supply to this customization. And in order for it to be unique, this name should be the reverse domain name of your organization extended with your customization name. So in case of the Open Charge Alliance, when we would bring out the customization, it would be called org.openchargealliance. For example, that is the name of this specific customization. And then if you have more than one message in the customization, you can also have an optional message name to define what the specific message is, so that the receiver knows what to expect in the data field. If the other side does not recognize the vendor ID or the message ID, then it will return an error message like unknown vendor ID or unknown message ID. So you should be aware of that. Well, let me show a quick, maybe not too useful example of a data transfer from a charge point. Suppose we have a custom message that allows a charge point to tell the central system that an internal combustion engine vehicle is parked here. So it does this by detecting that the parking bay is occupied and no cable is connected. If that occurs, then it sends a message to the central system with the vendor ID, my company ICE, the message ID ICE parked at CS, and the data string, which is in this case JSON formatted, which contains the start time when this is detected. Now this is exactly the data, how it's transferred over the line. Here you see that you can easily define your own messages. We can also do it the other way around. We have data transfer that's coming from the central system. Suppose that you have want a custom message to get charging totals from the charge point. So the central system then requests these charging totals from the charge point with a data transfer message. It says, okay, my customization is called com.mycompany.tx count, and the message ID is send CS totals. And I don't really need a data field because the message ID only is enough already for the charge point to know what to do. And then the charge point will answer with it the data transfer that says, okay, accepted. And I've accepted the message, and I'm returning the response, the data, namely main meter value being a certain value, and the number of seconds to date that have taken place on this charge point. Well, may or may not be too useful, but this shows you more or less what's possible with the data transfer command. Then the third option was the firmware update. Well, firmware update is for rare situations. It is suitable for sending large files to a charge point, because basically what the firmware update does is that it sends a firmware image to a charge point. Or in fact, it requests a charge point to download a new firmware image from a server. But yeah, you can also use it to download any other file. So if you have a kind of agreement with the charge point that depending on the name of the image, for example, the name of the file, for example, it knows what to do with it, you can also use it to send it a whole file with a set of display images or logos that you want to show on the display. Charge point will then download it from the server, and by looking at the name, it will know, for example, that it's not the firmware image, but it's display images. So it's possible, but it's a slow mechanism, and it requires a lot of status updates, like downloading, downloaded, installing, installed, etc. So its usage is limited. Well, there are some good practices that I would like to share with you if you are going to do any customizations. One of it is that if the other side refuses a data transfer that you sent with an unknown vendor ID or unknown message ID, then stop using it altogether, because the time you send it, it will fail. And so no use in repeating it then anymore. And the other good practice, more or less related to it, is that you should provide a custom configuration key to switch the customization on or off. You can use it, for example, when the other side does not respond well to your customization, or also very important, you can use it when you want to certify your implementation, because the certification process certifies a standard implementation. So if you have customizations, it's best that you can switch them off if you want to do the certification process. So far, the 1.6 release. Now, what are the possibilities in the 2.0.1 release? So there we have more options, because besides the data transfer and the firmware update mechanism, we now also have the device model that we can use, and we have a new extension called the custom data extension. I will explain them in more detail in the next slides. Now, first, the device model. For those of you who are not really familiar with it, it is, I think, important that I quickly explain again what it's all about. The device model allows the charging station to report components that it has, and the components that you can read and configure and do something with. Now, for each component, it will also report a number of variables that you can set or read. And each variable has, for example, so attributes like its value and characteristics like its data type. Well, this is the basic mechanism. I think that's very straightforward and easy to understand. But you can extend it with several optional features. And then it becomes a little bit more complicated, but the basics are still the same. So a component is not just one component in a charging station, but a component can have multiple instances. So, for example, if you have a cooling fan, you have a cooling fan component, and you have an instance top and an instance bottom. For example, we have a cooling fan in the top and then one in the bottom. And the component can also be located in a specific EVSE or connector. So if you have, for example, a physical meter, you might have a meter that reads for a specific EVSE, so that is located in the EVSE. That might also be the main meter of the entire charging station. Same goes for variables. A variable can just be a single instance, but you can also have multiple instances of a variable, because if you want to report the voltage of an AC connection, you might have 3 instances for each phase of this variable. Well, I will not go into all the details, but let me suffice it with saying that a variable also has multiple attributes, not just the actual value, but it can also have a target value, like this is your current value, but I want you to be at this value, like the cooling fan, I want you to run at 2000 RPM, but it reports its actual value, for example, as 1800 RPM. And a variable has some more characteristics also, like a unit or a maximum limit that it can have. And then last but definitely not least is the monitoring that we can attach to a variable. So the central system can set a monitor on a variable and tell the charge point to give a warning when a variable exceeds a certain value, for example, or goes below a certain value. But this is a very powerful tool for monitoring certain conditions in the charge point. So let me show an example how you can use the device model for the example that we had for 1.6, where we wanted to request the main meter value and the total number of transactions from the charging station. So we can also get this information via the device model. because we have the get variables command where we get the value of variables in the device model. So we say, okay, I want to get the variable from the main meter of the charging station, a component. It's a standardized name, a defined name for this component, what it would be called, physical metering. And I want the value of the variable energy import register. This is also a standardized name in the specification that such a meter has a register, it would be called like this. And then there is also a component called the transaction controller. And from that controller, I want to have the variable count. So, and you see that without any custom message, you will be able to get this information from the charging station. Assuming that the charging station has implemented the device model to such a detail that it's populates the values for these variables. Another example is the monitoring that you can do. As a CSO, for example, you could configure a monitor on the temperature in your charging station. So with the set variable monitoring command, I can send certain monitoring data to it. So I can tell it that on the temperature sensor of the charging station, I want to be notified whenever it exceeds 60 degrees Celsius, for example. And so you set a monitor for upper threshold of 60, and then whatever this value exceeds 60, then the charging station will send the notification. So I think it shows a bit the power of the device model and how much you can already configure without the need to create custom messages. But there are, of course, situations where this is not enough. So for that, we have the custom data extension. The custom data extension allows the adding of fields to any message. The custom data is an optional element in the JSON schema of OCPP for every message, actually every message element. And this is an element that allows the definition of additional properties. So you can add your own fields there that are not defined in the official schema definition. But you need to provide a vendor ID field so that the other side knows what kind of customization to expect. Now, of course, I have an example of that. Suppose I have a setup where I want to experiment a little bit with vehicle to grid on my charging station, and I want to use the charging schedule for that. So I want to extend the existing charging schedule with a discharging limit. The normal charging schedule period, you see it here, has a limit, which is the charging limit, and I want to add a discharging limit. But then I can simply add to the message the custom data element with the vendor ID called com.vendor.myv2x and the new field discharging limit. So the other side will read that data and will then be able to deal with it. And if you have an implementation that does not recognize that extension, it will simply ignore it. Now, of course, an implementation of vehicle to grid is not as simple as that. A lot more is needed for that. And I just want to let you know that the Open Charge Alliance is working with some market parties to create V2X features for OCPP. They will be included in the 2.1 release. And we might even release that as a set of custom data extensions that you could use in 2.0.1. But it's still under development, undergoing some first pilots. Then we have the data transfer, of course, that is exactly the same as in 1.6. And even your 1.6 data transfer messages would also work in 2.0.1. And we have the firmware update mechanism, no change there. So it is vital that if you implement a custom data or a data transfer customization, that you report this in the device model as a customization controller instance. So that way, the CSMS will know that customization exists and whether it is active. So, for example, it would look like this. The charging station would report the component customization controller, and then an instance with the instance name being the vendor ID. So in this case, it would be com.vendor.myv2x. And attached to that component instance is a variable enabled, and it has the value true. This tells the CSMS that this customization is present and it is currently enabled. But it could go even further, because I have a component and I can add more variables to it. So if I have some specific configuration variables for my customization, I could add it here. So it would have a max discharge limit that I, for some reason, want to define for the customization. And I could have a max offline duration. Now it tells my customization that, okay, if I'm offline for more than 300 seconds, then I should stop doing V2X. Just an example of what you can do with it. Now, again, for 2.0.1, we also have a number of good practices. So I'll go through them. First of all, we advise to always try to solve your customization request that you have for your feature with the device model capabilities, because you can do a lot with that without having to resort to custom data. If that doesn't work, then you can use custom data or data transfer. If you have a customization reported as a controller, allow the customization to be switched off. And be sure to choose a vendor ID as a reverse domain name of your organization and your feature, so that you can really switch off a specific customization or switch it on. Now, how should you choose a certain customization? I have a few rules that might be useful for that. So if you have a situation where you want to report a state or a value or an event, or want the CSMS to configure or control some components, then the device model is most suited. And you can set values, you can use any of the existing variables and components, but you could even create your own components and variables if you need to. And you can use the monitoring to control all kinds of situations, and it could also be triggers from messages that you want to be sent when a charging state changes or whatever. It can really become quite complicated. On the other hand, if you have an existing message and you just want to add some extra data, like we saw in the vehicle to grid example, then you can probably better use custom data, because it's very easy to extend an existing message with that. Then, if you have really a completely new message and you think it's not suitable in the device model, then you can still use the data transfer message. And of course, in the end, if all else fails, you can also do upload a large file to a charging station, but that is for rare situations, like I mentioned, for example, to upload logos or use configuration sets or whatever. It's not very common and not very practical to do so. Okay, so to wrap this up, I see I've gone a little bit faster than I had expected to, but well, I hope we were still able to follow the storyline. We see in 2.0.1 that we support multiple customization methods. And the device model can solve many of them without really having to resort to custom messages. Then, if you still have to customize in 2.0.1, the custom data is probably the most easy way to extend existing messages. But if all else fails, then the good old data transfer still exists, and you can use that to send anything over the line. Well, that concludes my presentation on the customization methods in OCPP 1.6 and 2.0.1. So I think now's the time to answer any questions that you might have in this.
Thank you, Frank. I'm looking at the question box. If anyone has questions, please ask them in the questions box, and so Frank can answer them. Let's see. The first one was a good one. Is there a preferred naming convention for custom configuration keys to avoid accidental naming conflicts when new standardized keys are introduced in future versions of the spec?
Well, I assume that is then about the 1.6 configuration keys. And for the 1.6 configuration keys, we don't have a naming convention for those keys. So for the vendor ID and the message ID in the data transfer, we do supply it, but not for the configuration keys. So it might be wise, if you fear that there might be some conflict with the naming in the future, that you also prepend that with your organization name, for example.
Okay. Let's see. Will customizations break interoperability?
Yes, they certainly can break interoperability, because if you customize anything, if you implement a customization, then the other side that you're talking with, be it a charging station or a central system, needs to have implemented the same customization. That's why you need to be able to handle the situation that if you send a data transfer and the other side returns a message with a known vendor ID or a known message ID, that you are able to deal with that, because then you're apparently talking to a system that has not implemented the customization. In the case of custom data, in that's in 2.0.1, you can add your own custom properties to the custom data element. And suppose the central system that you're sending it to, or the CSMS in 2.0.1 as it's called, CSMS that you're sending it to has not implemented this customization, then the JSON parser will not break on that, because it's specifically defined in the schema that this custom data can have optional elements. But it will just get this custom data element with a vendor ID that it doesn't know and some properties that it doesn't know what to do with. So it will simply ignore it in that case. So you should be aware that that's possible. It might even be that the other side simply returns a message with an error, with maybe more information in the status info on what was the problem. So if you do implement customizations, make sure that you are robust to deal with a situation where the other side does not have the customization. I hope this answers the question. No.
Yep. If I want to create custom configuration variables, is this allowed? And if so, what is the best practice for this?
Yes, you can create custom configuration variables. We do advise you to carefully check the specification and the appendix. It has a whole list of predefined configuration variables. Now you should know that in the OCPP device model, you have a whole list of components on the one hand and a whole list of variables on the other hand. And they can be freely combined. So because as OCPP or as Open Charge Alliance, we do not want you to prescribe which variables belong to which components because we don't know what somebody in the field wants to implement. So any combination is possible. So wherever you can see if there is a predefined variable that suits your purpose, and if there's not, then you can define your own variable, and this variable will then be reported to the CSMS when it requests a configuration report, for example, from the charging station. And we'll also report what data type it is, what its limits are. So the CSMS should be able to know what to do with it. It knows what type it is and what its limits are and whether it can be set or not. And then you need to make sure that you somehow document so that the other party knows what to do with this variable. And we also advise that if you create a custom component, you can also create a custom component or a custom variable, that you notify the Open Charge Alliance about this, because we plan to keep a list of existing extensions of the device model, so that maybe in the future we can incorporate that into the next update of the standard.
Okay. Let's see. Can I reuse my custom messages from 1.5 implementation?
I assume this refers to the data transfer message. Yeah, the data transfer message itself has not changed, so you should be able to reuse that as well. Yeah.
Okay. And is it possible to change power, for instance, kilowatt, during the charging?
Yes, that's definitely possible. That's normally something that we do with a charging schedule. So you would set a charging profile to regulate the power during a session. But I expect this might be referring to whether you would be able to use the device model to change the power. That depends very much on the implementation of the charging station. If the charging station reports a power value for its EVSE that is writable, then you could write a new value to that variable, for example, or set a new max set attribute, maximum value that its variable is allowed to have, and then the EVSE would respond to that. Because if the EVSE does not respond to that, then it would report this variable as being read-only. So it's not a likely case, but it would be possible.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, I have another one. Can I certify my custom messages?
No, we don't do that, because of course the whole certification process is a very rigid process with a set of predefined test cases, and yeah, anything custom cannot be part of that. So that's why it's best to be able to switch off your customization so that it doesn't interfere with your certification. And if you cannot switch off your customization, then yeah, you should make sure that it does not interfere with the standard behavior during a certification process.
Okay. Let's see, I don't see any new questions coming in, but I would like to remind everyone that you can always contact us with your questions, and you can also join us. Join the Open Charge Alliance. please visit our website to do so. Let's see. Oh, here we go. Now they want to ask questions. Let's see if I can make this out. Which message should be used if CS wants to send firmware URL instead of real-life firmware file?
Okay, the way I understand it is that it's a question if you want to send something else than a real firmware image. And because if you want to send a file to a charging station, you can just use the firmware update mechanism, and then in the firmware update message you send the name, or actually the URL of the file that you have to recover. You have to download. But if you agree, for example, with your charging station implementation, that okay, if this firmware image is called display images, then it knows, okay, it has to retrieve this file, but not treat it as a firmware image, but instead use them to display on the image as the vendor logos, for example. So it's by convention. It's just the same message, but you make a convention between the central system and the charging station to do it that way.
Okay. Let's see, is it possible to customize OCPP 1.6 to work with QR codes to enable or disable the charge point?
Yes, that's possible, but I'm not sure how it affects OCPP, because normally if you have a QR label on the attached to the charging station, the user would scan that QR label with his mobile phone, and then the mobile phone would then interpret that data and use a different protocol, something like OCPI, for example, to tell the CSMS what to do with it. So that does not require any customization of OCPP. On the other hand, if you want to be really advanced and you want to display a QR code on the charging station display, so it's not a sticker, but it's a dynamic QR code. Yeah, then you could probably also do that with a change configuration, and you could define a configuration key called my QR code with a certain value, and then assume that the charging station has the software to take that value and encode it as a QR code and show it on the display. So it's definitely doable.